In the last lecture, we learned that Angular injects dependencies on a hierarchical basis. That means when we provide a service on a component, Angular will create and inject an instance of that service for that component and for all its child components and their child components. And we also learned that we can override the instance provided by the parent component in the child component. And this can introduce some unforeseen bugs in our application. And that's what we are going to understand in this lecture. Okay, so let's get started. So here I have created a brand new Angular project called user service. Now in this project, currently we have only one component, which is this app component. Now the first thing which I'm going to do is inside this app folder, I'm going to create a new folder and let's call this folder services. So inside this folder, we are going to keep all our services. Inside this services folder, let's go ahead and let's create a new service and let's call this service user service. And since it is a TypeScript file, we are going to use this .ts extension. All right. So inside this user service file, let's create and export a class. And let's call this class user service. And inside this user service class, I'm going to create an array of users. Okay, so let's create a property called users. And to this, let's assign an array. And inside this array, we are going to have a list of users. So let's say this user is going to have a name property. Let's say the name of the user is John, and it is also going to have a status property. So the status will be either active or inactive. So let's say this user John is active. In the same way, let's go ahead and let's create two more user objects. Let's call the second user object maybe Mark and third user object Steve. And let's make this user Mark as inactive. Okay, so here we have created a user service, and inside this user service we have a property called user, which is storing a list of users. Now what we want is we want to display all these three users in the web page. And to do that, what we are going to do is we are going to assign this users property of this user service class to a property in the app component class. Okay, so inside this app component class, let's create a new property. Let's call it users again. And this property is going to store an array of objects, right? Because to this users property, we want to assign this users array of this user service class. And what does this users array contain? It contains a list of objects. And each of these objects has a name and a status property. So we can specify the type of this users property as an object, which is going to have a name property, and the value of this name property will be string. And it is also going to have a status property, which is also going to be of type string. Okay, and this users property is going to store an array of such objects. So for that, we need to use square brackets. And initially, let's set it to empty array. Now let's go ahead and let's implement ng on init method. And to use this method, we also need to implement the onInit interface. So let's use this implements keyword, and here we want to implement on init interface. And in order to use this interface, we also need to import it from Angular Core. Now inside this ng onInit, what we want is we want to assign this user's property of this app component class with the user's property of this user service class. And for that, we need an instance of this user service class inside this app component class. Okay, and we want Angular to inject an instance of this user service class inside this app component class. So for that, we need to do two things. First, we need to specify a constructor for this app component class. And this constructor will receive an instance of this user service class. So here, let's specify a parameter. Let's call it maybe user service. And it is going to be of type user service. And in order to use this user service class inside this app component class, we also need to import it. Okay. Then let's also use a private keyword in front of this user service parameter, so that behind the scenes a property called user service will be created and that will be assigned with this parameter. And then we can use that property throughout this app component class. Now here we have tell Angular that we want an instance of this user service class. But we have not tell Angular how it can provide us an instance of this user service class. For that, we need to specify the providers property inside this at component metadata. Right. So let's use this providers property, and to this we can assign an array, and inside this array we can specify the types for which we need Angular to inject an instance. In this case, we want Angular to inject an instance of this user service class. So we can specify that inside this array. With this, an instance of this user service class will be available inside this user service parameter. Now we can access this user service parameter inside this ngOnInit, because here we have used private keyword in front of it. So behind the scenes, a private property called user service has been created. So for that, what we can do is we can say this dot user service dot users. Okay, so here we are accessing the users property of this user service class. That means we are accessing this property, and we want to assign this users array to the users property of this app component class. Okay, so here let's say this dot users equals this dot user service dot users. So now this users property of this app component class will be assigned with this array. Okay, so this array. Now what we can do is we can loop over this array and we can display it in the web page. For that, in the app component.html, let's write some HTML. And in order to save some time, I have already written that HTML. So let's grab it from here and let's paste it here. Okay, now here we are hard coding these values, but we want to display these values from this users array. So what we can do is we can loop over that users array using ng for. And inside the double quotes, let's create a variable. Let's call it user of users. And then here, let's use string interpolation. And here, let's say user dot name. In the same way, instead of displaying this hard-coded value active, here let's use the status property of the user. Okay. Now, in order to design this HTML, I have also written some CSS. So let's also grab that from here. And let's paste it inside the app component.css file. With this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. And here you can see all those three users are displayed in the web page. So John, Mark, and Steve. And these are the users which we have inside this users array, John, Mark, and Steve. Okay, so in this way, we are accessing this users array of this user service class inside this app component class. Let's close this CSS file here. All right, now what we want is we also want to provide users an ability to add some new users in the web page. For that, what we want is we want to display a text box in the web page where we can enter the username. Then we also want to display a drop-down list from where we can select whether the user is active or inactive. And then we also want to add a button. And when we click on that button, that new user should be added in the web page. For that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new component. So let's go ahead and let's open VS Code built-in terminal. And to create a new component, we can use ng generate command. And here we want to generate a component, and let's call this component maybe add user. Let's press enter. Okay, so this add user component has been created. Now, the first thing which I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this add user component.html, And here I'm going to write some HTML which will display a text box, a drop down and a button in the web page. And again, in order to save some time, I have already written that HTML. So let's grab that HTML from here and let's paste it inside this add user component.html file. And to design this HTML, I have also written some CSS. Let's grab that CSS as well. And let's use it inside add user component.css file. Let's save the changes. Let me close this and let's go to the web page. All right, so it is not displaying that text box and that drop down. That's because we also need to use the selector of this add user component inside this app component. So before this div, let's go ahead and let's use this selector. Okay, let's save the changes now. And now let's go to the web page. And you can see a text box, a drop down, and a button has been added. So what I want is we can enter a name here inside this text box. Let's say Mary, and then we can select whether this user Mary is active or inactive from this drop down. And when I click on this create user button, it should create this user and it should display it in this list. So let's see how to do that. Let's go back to VS Code and let's first go to this user service class. And inside this class, let's go ahead and let's create a method, and let's call this method add new user. And this method is going to receive a name which is going to be of type string, and it is also going to receive a status, and again it is going to be of type string. And now what we want is we want to push this new user to this users array. So for that we can say this dot users dot push. So this push method adds a new element in an array. Now what do we want to push here to this users array? We want to push an object. For that, let's use curly braces. And this object is going to have a name property, and the value of the name property will be the value which we will receive inside this name parameter. And then we also want to have a status property, and the value of this status property will be the value which we will receive inside this status parameter. Okay, now we want to call this method from our add user component. So again, we want to have an instance of this user service class inside our add user component class. So again, in the constructor, let's specify a parameter. Let's call it user service. Now you can call this parameter anything, but the type here will be user service. And in order to use this type, we also need to import it. All right, and again, let's use private keyword in front of it. So again, here we are telling user what we want, but how do we want? We have not told it yet. So for that, we need to use the providers property of this add component decorator. And here, let's specify this type as user service. So now Angular will inject an instance of this user service class, and it will assign it to this user service parameter. Now here, let's also go ahead and let's create two properties. The first property, let's call it username. It is going to be of type string, and initially let's assign it with the value empty string. And let's create a status property. It is also going to be of type string, and initially let's assign it with the value maybe active. Okay, and now let's go ahead and let's bind this username property to this input element. For that, I am going to make use of two-way data binding. So for two-way data binding, we use a set of square brackets. Inside that, we use a set of parentheses, and inside that, we specify ng model. And we want to bind this ng model with this username property. Okay, so basically we are binding this input element with this username property. Whatever value the user will enter inside this input element, inside this text box, that will be assigned to this username property. In the same way, we also want to bind this drop down list here, this select element, with the status property of this add user component. So let me copy this property name here and let's specify it here. So whatever value the user will select from the drop down, that will be assigned to this status property. And in order to use this ng model, if you remember, we also need to import it. So inside this import section, we need to specify forms module, and we need to import this forms module from Angular/forms. Okay, let's save the changes here inside this app module file and let's close it. And now let's again go to add user component, and here let's create a method, and let's call this method add user. And from within this method, let's call the add new user method of this user service class. For that, let's say this dot user service dot add new user. And to this add new user method, we have to specify a value for this name property, this name parameter and this status parameter. So for that, let's pass the value which we have inside this username property. So here let's say this dot username. And in the same way, for the status parameter, let's pass the value which we have inside this status property of this users, this add user component. And finally, let's bind this add user method on this button element. Okay, so here we want to bind click event, and we want to bind this click event with this add user method. And let's also do one more thing. Let's log the new array in the console. So for that, let's say console.log, and let's log this dot user service dot users array. Okay, so in the web page, when the user will click on this create user button, that new user will be added to this users array of this user service class, and we are logging that. Okay, with this, let's save the changes. Let's go to the web page. Let's open developer console. Okay, here let's clear everything, and let's enter a name here. So let's say the username is Mary, and let's set the status as inactive, and let's click on this create user button. So here you can see an array has been logged, and this array has 4 elements. So this new user Mary, and whose status is inactive, has been added here in this array. But in the app component, when we are looping over that array, it is not adding that new user in the web page. So here you see we still have only 3 users, but in the array now we have 4 users, right? If I go ahead and add one more user, let's say Sarah, and let's say she's active, and I click on this create user button, now we have 5 users in that array, but still in the web page we are seeing only 3 users. So why is that? The reason we have this bug here is because if you notice, in the app component, we are creating an instance of this user service, because here we have specified this providers array. So here Angular will provide us an instance of this user service, and we are looping over that instance, right? We are assigning this users property using this user service instance. But in the add user component, here also we are providing this user service. So here Angular will inject a new instance, and when we are adding new users using this text box and this drop down, and by clicking on this create user button, that new user is getting added for this instance. Okay, the instance of this add user component class. But here we are looping over the instance of the user service class from this app component. So this user service instance is different from this user service instance because this add user component, if you notice here, this component is a child component of the app component. So here when we have used these providers, here Angular has created a new instance and that has been injected for this add user component. So this instance is overriding the instance of this app component. Okay, so when we are adding the new users, that new user is getting added for this instance and not for this instance of app component. And that's why we are not seeing these new users in the web page. So basically, here we are not using the dependency injection properly. To solve this issue, all we have to do is we have to comment this providers from here, or you can simply remove it. So now we will receive the same instance of this user service class for app component as well as add user component, because this add user is a child component of this app component. And we have learned that when we specify a provider on a component, the same instance gets injected for that component and its child components. And same thing will happen here. So now this same instance will be injected for this app component as well as this add user component, because now we have removed this providers from this add user component. With this, if I save the changes and if I go to the web page, and now if I add a new user, let's say Mary, and let's select inactive and let's click on this create user, you can see that now that user has been added. In the same way, let's also add another user called Sarah. Let's say she's active and let's click on this create user. So now Sarah has been added here. Okay, so now our application is working as expected. And that's what I meant when I said that since we are able to override an instance of the parent component service, it might introduce some bugs in our application. So when I'm using the same instance of this user service class in the app component as well as in the add user component, our application is working as expected. But if I use, if I provide this user service inside this add user component as well, in that case, a new instance of this user service is getting injected for this add user component. And this instance will override the instance injected from the app component. Okay, so now we will be working on two different instances of the user service. And because of that, we have that issue. So if we use the same instance, so if I remove this providers from this add user component, in that case, our application is working as expected. So I hope with this example, now it is clear to you how hierarchical dependency injection works in Angular. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask it. Thank you for listening and have a great day.